Michelle Zauner is a multi-hyphenate talent. I mean, she's an accomplished musician, better known as Japanese Breakfast, and with the release of her debut memoir, Crying in H Mart, she's proven herself to be an accomplished writer. And full circle, the book has been optioned to be made into a movie, which Michelle will provide the soundtrack for, which, not bad for someone who is just barely into her 30s. Now, of course, when Korean parents are thinking multi-hyphenate, they're probably thinking more along the lines of Super Korean, SEAL, Doctor, Astronaut, Johnny Kim, whose mother I'm sure is an absolute delight amongst the Korean community. I mean, oh, Johnny, he's been so busy lately. Did I tell you? He discovered a Taliban hideout while performing open-heart surgery in space. But enough about Johnny. I heard you have some fantastic news too. Little Michael, congratulations are in order. I heard he's the new assistant manager at the Olive Garden. You must be so proud. Anyway, there was no way I wasn't going to be picking up this particular novel. It grew out of a viral essay in 2018 of the same name that appeared in The New Yorker. And it's about Michelle's experience growing up in Oregon to a white father and a Korean mother. The Korean mother who she lost to cancer in 2014. Her mother was only 56 at the time, Michelle 25. Not quite Jimmy Fallon big as far as a musician goes or the accomplished writer that we know of today. Anyway, if you are uncertain about whether you want to pick up the book or not, just read that essay, which is available online. It comprises the first chapter of the memoir, and it gives you an idea of what you're in for and proves how accomplished a writer that Michelle is. So TLDR, go read the thing. It's a fantastic read, but it's hard for me to be objective about this thing. This book is very particular to me, especially with its focus on being a second-generation Korean and its love of food. I mean, I have lots of thoughts on this book, but these are thoughts that are particular to me and my experience, which mirrors very closely to that of Michelle's, who is still an entire generation younger than I am, but it's also reflective of my own daughter's biracial experience growing up. And honestly, food, here specifically Korean food, is just the perfect entryway into your own cultural identity, especially when you don't speak the language. Okay, seriously, last chance to bail. Reader synopsis, love the book, well worth the read. You should totally pick it up. But from here on in, we're talking digressions and tangents. This book sent me down so many different rabbit holes. So there you have it. Anyway, I grew up not speaking Korean. I mean, I'm familiar with it. I sort of understand quite a bit. There's a lot of phrases and terms that I'd hear over and over repeated that I do remember. Things like, come here, go outside, time to eat, and why would you do that? And like most immigrant Koreans coming here to the country, my parents insisted that we be adept at the English language. First and foremost, that we be fluent and accentless in our English. But strangely enough, they insisted that we go to Hangul Hakgyo, which is Korean school. Now, Michelle had the luxury of going on Friday evenings. My brother and I, we had to go on Saturday mornings. We'd get on a bus, head downtown, visit an otherwise empty little public school, and basically sound out Korean words like two oversized preschoolers. We would do this for years, to the point now I can sort of haltingly, fumblingly read through some Korean, but unfortunately I have no ability to make an association to the sounds I'm making to the actual meaning of the word. It's like being able to pronounce fish and yet not recognize that it's an aquatic sea creature that tastes great with tartar sauce. But the bigger injustice, the larger crime that made Hangul Hakgyo the bane of my existence was, by dint of it being on Saturday mornings, meant that I missed Saturday morning cartoons entirely. Now, kids these days probably have no notion of this thing called Saturday morning cartoons. If they want to watch Peppa Pig or Ollie and Moon, they can get it 24/7 on demand from whatever subscription service they happen to be a part of. But for us growing up, Saturday mornings meant, if you weren't going to Hangul Hakgyo, sitting on the couch with a bowl of Fruit Loops and proceeding to watch 3 to 4 hours of Thundar the Barbarian, Captain Caveman, and Danger Mouse, not to mention a constant stream of commercials telling you what awesome toy was coming out next, like the G.I. Joe, USS Flag, aircraft carrier, or Teddy Ruxpin. So Korean school pretty well taught me nothing other than a basic sort of apprehension of the language, and I, like Michelle, had a pat Korean phrase to explain my lack of fluency. For Michelle, it was "Yuri 엄마 한국 사람, 아빠 미국 사람," which is basically, my mom is Korean, my dad is American. For me, my Korean safe words were 한국말 아주 조금만 알아요, which I think means I know very little Korean, hopefully delivered with enough of a mangled accent to avoid further conversation. And so, in a particularly me sort of problem, this meant avoiding half the convenience stores in town for fear that the Korean Mr. Kim working behind the counter would start in on me in Korean, and then suddenly realizing that I was not fluent, express shame on behalf of my parents, a lot of sighs and I chum, and then berate me for not being fluent in Korean before handing me off my Mountain Dew. So it's probably best that I avoid them all altogether. Language is ever evolving anyways. My folks, their Korean is stuck in the 1960s, so much so when they went back to Korea in the 90s, they felt almost rural and clumsy with their words. It's no different than, let's say, falling into a coma in the 1960s and waking up in the present day. You'd be able to communicate just fine, but it wouldn't take long before you would encounter words that you'd recognize, but the cultural sentiment behind them have changed in the ensuing years. Things like snowflake, woke, gender fluid. And then there's all these words that you'd otherwise have never heard of before that were suddenly in common rotation, like libtard, turf, MAGA. And with the internet, languages evolving even faster, and suddenly you would be feeling lost with things like thought, lols, chuggy, and simp. And for myself, I'm even one step further removed. My parents, they're sort of losing their grip on the Korean language as it continues to evolve, and I don't even speak it. So food is the one thing that allows me to tap into my own cultural heritage. It's so ingrained in my memories and my experiences growing up. Like language, Korean food has also evolved. I mean, my mom grew up in a small, poor, rural community, and she herself has professed to not be a fantastic Korean cook at all. Her two sisters are nuns, still living in that small community, and when I visited them, their food was modest, simple, and very familiar to the foods that I had growing up. And on top of that, my mom really embraced notions of Western health and healthy eating, which meant a lot less salt and oil in her food, which meant a lot less soy sauce and sesame oil, key staples in Korean foods, and far less emphasis on meat and more on vegetables, which meant I grew up eating a lot more dubujjigae or miyeokguk and far less bulgogi or dakbokkeumtang. And then I find out recently this thing called cheese buldak, which is basically fired chicken with cheese. And cheese is a notion completely foreign to the idea of Korean food. I've never had that growing up. My folks know nothing about that, and yet this stuff was everywhere when I visited Korea a few years ago. So, like Michelle Zauner, I take to the internet to find Korean recipes, and I, much like her, rely on one Emily Kim, better known as Mangchi. I love Mangchi's Korean cooking videos, which may seem a little broken considering both my parents are still alive, but I want the modern, evolved Korean cooking filled with all that salt, fat, acid, and heat without any concessions to notions of health. Anyway, I also love that there's so many other great Korean cooking videos online, and I especially love, you should check it out, Korean ramen hacks. I also have a whole host of Korean recipe books at home, but my absolute favorite is the Illustrated Cook Korean by Robin Ha. Her recipe for jeokduppap is the one I rely on consistently. I'm also grateful for the fact that I live in a town, while it may not have an H Mart, still has a local Korean grocery store that I rely on to get my gochujang, my fish cake, and my kimchi. We have 2 supermarket-sized Asian food stores, which I can reliably count on to get my Korean snacks, my kalbi marinade, and Korean pear. And I still insist on Costco, which still has the best toasted seaweed going. I learned how to make kimchi here in town from a local biracial Korean chef, even though my folks still make their own kimchi and have a dedicated kimchi fridge just for that. It's just like I'm cobbling together bits and pieces of my own food identity, sort of collecting this larger community that I've fashioned for myself. Korean food and love of it is that one piece of culture that I can pass on to my daughter. She has learned to love kimchi. My wife loves kimchi as well. Fun fact, when my wife and I got married, our midnight buffet was comprised entirely of Korean food. This meant this was the first time the Dutch side of the family ever encountered kimchi. Frankly, it went over a lot better than I thought it would, although certainly an open bar helps with these things. My daughter, she knows the joys of sticky rice, of wrapping food in seaweed before popping it in your mouth, of garlic and gochujang, of bulgogi and banchan. And I, like Michelle, grew up being very aware of my otherness in a white community, but at the same time, Korean food was always served at dinner. It was the one constant, and I never really thought much of it. So I know the joys of seaweed soup for birthdays or rice cake soup for New Year's, of peeling fruit in one long, unbroken strip, and of the perfect cold picnic food that is gimbap. It is all about so many different types of kimchi and dried squid, although dried squid is the one Korean food that we are not allowed to make in our house because I made it once, heated it up in the oven, and for days the entire house smelled like dead cephalopod. So yeah, never again. And I also know the joys of having medicinal teas served to you by some ancient Chinese herbal medicine doctor. Hers, Michelle's, ended up tasting like fruit rinds, dredged or steeped in murky lake water. Mine was a pureed deer antler that was steeped in water, which tasted like pureed deer antler steeped in hot water. I remember seeing the nuns at the monastery able to pick a fish down to its barest bones armed with nothing more than some metal chopsticks. I remember getting served thin slices of pork hock dredged in gochujang served with a sliver of garlic, octopus tentacles emerging out of a pool of red sauce, of barbecue pork wrapped in a lettuce leaf, or side dishes for days. I mean, Koreans are so fiercely proud of their food, and they're especially loyal to their kimchi. I love that it's become a lot more ubiquitous over the years. I mean, I can get kimchi at my local grocery store right now, and a lot of the finer restaurants in town are incorporating aspects of kimchi in some of their meals. Still, we can get a little protective as far as kimchi goes. We may take umbrage over the fact more recently of a Bon Appetit video of some white chef making kimchi long before the cultural and racial reckoning that would take down the channel more or less. Anyway, I found that his kimchi was a little too orange for my liking, and I loved how one of the commenters described the chef himself as a golden retriever that went to culinary school. Aside from food, I also now know that all Korean mothers play hutto with the volume dialed up to 11. I remember my otherwise quiet mom screaming like a banshee as she slammed her playing card on the table to claim her trick in the game, or yelling at the top of her lungs, throwing yutnori sticks in the air, looking for a strategic gull to knock me off my place on the board. It's all there. It's this wonderful excavation of my own life experience on the page for me to read, and it's such an experience. This is the typical second-generation experience as a non-native speaker growing up in a mostly white community, this sort of internalized racism turning to reclamation as we age. Loved it. Now, Michelle's father feels a little bit put out by the book, considering he wasn't even mentioned in the acknowledgments, even though Michelle's white husband's parents were. A lot of that can be explained by this fantastic essay Michelle recently wrote for Harper's Bazaar that talks about how her father moved on after the death of her mother by dating an Indonesian woman 7 years younger than Michelle's Zauner herself, which prompted Michelle to actually create a pseudonym so she could creep this girl's private Instagram page. This is as good a piece of writing as you're going to find, and it is sort of a bittersweet and sharp epilogue to the story Crying in H Mart. I'll have a link to that story down below as well in the description. Anyway, after finishing this, I immediately went and visited my folks, stopped off at the Asian grocery store and got myself some ready-made gimbap, family-sized bottle of yogurty, and yeah, I can't recommend this book enough, even if you don't know the difference between oi mul and mat kimchi. Anyway, that's it for me this week. Yeah, again, a bit of a wait since the last video. Hopefully I can get on a bit of a rhythm as far as these videos goes, but honestly, work has been crazy lately. Best that I can do. So that is it. I hope you're all keeping safe. Wishing you a great week of reading, and hopefully we'll talk to you again soon.